Are you guys ready to spend a half hour of your time with me? I promise you it'll be worth it, because today we're starting a new project. Everything we've built to this point was made to terrorize the streets, but the shell of this '65 Mustang has a whole different fate.
Back in the day, you would see a lot of pre-muscle and muscle cars on the track, especially NASCAR. Big blocks and small block V8s were making serious horsepower and taking names in the race car world. In 1966, race fans were taken by storm with a new endurance road race created by the SCCA called the Trans-American Sedan Championship Series. This would allow muscle cars to compete with their European counterparts on American turf. By 1968, the Big Three were not only at war at the dealership.
Won't pass any deal in this '68 Mustang. Get your free stuffed animals each appraisal.
They were at war at the track. The raceways were also proving grounds for pony cars. Challengers, Cudas, Camaros, Mustangs, Cougars, and Javelins. Between the years '68 and '72, the muscle car was king. Guys like Roger Penske, Parnelli Jones, Dan Gurney, and Mark Donohue were just a few of the names in the Trans Am world that helped put Detroit muscle on the map. Eventually, these cars were retired, and a new modern breed of race car began to surface. But that didn't mean that these old war horses of the track were forgotten. As the years passed, the love for these cars and the passion for racing them grew. Once again, these now vintage race cars were brought out of retirement to tear up the road. The birth of a new sanctioning body for motorsports racing finally happened. The SVRA. The popularity of these cars and races got bigger and bigger.
So here's what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna build a car that looks like a vintage road racer, but doesn't run like a vintage road racer.
The sanctioning body that will allow me to build it is the NASA, or National Auto Sport Association. There's performance touring, super unlimited, time trial racing, American Iron Extreme, and American Iron Vintage. This is exactly what I'm looking for. These classes are what I like to call run what you brung.
Here's what I'm gonna bring. This is a 351 Ford punched out the 408. Now there's a lot of theories about how to build an engine for road racing. Who better to ask than Mike Galley? He grew up in the pits helping his dad with their circle track cars. Then he landed a job as a technician and R&D specialist for BBK and Brothers Performance Warehouse. Of course, everything was tested at the track. He also built and drove cars in the American Iron Series, so he's no stranger to the needs of a successful road racer. So Mike, what was your reasoning for building this engine the way you did?
Well, it's pretty simple. The lighter the rotating assembly, piston, crank, and rods, the faster the engine's going to accelerate. So if it's going in a road race car, the faster it comes out of the corner and down the straightaway, faster the time it's going to turn. The Roush Racer 401 started out with a Ford SVO block with 4-bolt mains for strength. Then we threw in a lightweight forged rotating assembly for reliability and quicker acceleration due to the lighter rotating mass. The pistons are flat tops and they're capped off with a set of Cometic head gaskets to seal the Roush cylinder heads that are giving us a compression ratio of 12:1. We went with a hydraulic roller camshaft using 1/6 stud mount roller rockers for minimal parasitic power loss through the valve train. Finally, it was time to seal up the engine, and we wanted something different that would be reliable, repetitive, and have great throttle response. So we went with an 8-stack electronic fuel injection system with 8 billet air valves that act sort of like small 1-barrel carbs. And all that was worth it. On the dyno, it kicked out 534 horsepower and 533 foot-pounds of torque. I'll tell you what, Lou, the motor's yours as long as I get some seat time in that car.
No sweat. There's a lot of work that has to happen before this can go in its new home over there. And it all starts with this rusty jig, this pile of metal stock, and a few miles of welding wire. Because this car was built for everyday driving. It's going to require a whole new frame, and I'll show you how to do that after the break. Hey, welcome back. We're in the middle of stripping out this '65 Fastback to turn it into a serious road racer. But before we do that, there's a few more measurements that I gotta take. Remember, this Ford 351 Windsor punched out the 408, will be throwing this Mustang around the track. So a stronger frame is today's project. Being that we're running Outlaw Racer, safety is really important. And that safety starts with a good chassis, so your choice of metal is really important. Weight is an issue as well. This 2x3 083 wall tubing is plenty strong enough, but will keep us in the weight class we want. All three sanctioning bodies recognize the SCCA for safety specifications for building a road racer. Everything from fire systems to frames. However, you vintage racers, you have a lot more rules and regulations that you need to follow. That's why I'm going outlaw. All I got to worry about is the safety. I'm using a chop saw today to speed things up. So earlier I created some leveling blocks to keep the cut square. The rule book says little about the chassis. Strength is your priority. Another important tool is this frame jig. It may not be much to look at, but it's really hard to get the job done without one. I've even made them out of wood before. You just got to make sure it's solid and don't catch it on fire when you weld on it. I leveled the jig before I started, and I'll recheck everything as we go. This little bubble is your best friend. With the second side rail in place and level, 2 temporary cross members will keep it square. These plates will hold them flush. Now it's time to start the front end. There are endless measurements and calculations to get this right, but the simplest and probably most accurate method, mimic an original frame and raise it some to accommodate your larger wheels and tires that you plan to run. I'm angling the kick-ups at 37 degrees for additional strength. And now for the frame horn, which is the mounting point for the bulk of the front end. I've told you guys before how much heat can move metal. Here's a prime example. These frame horns were level when I started out. One bead pulled it out that much. It's about 1 inch. I gotta fix that. So I'll cut out any tack welds, add additional clamping to the frame, and with the jack, I'll force the frame rail where I want it to go and try it again. Like I said earlier, triple check everything. All three of your sanctioning bodies require a logbook for inspection. Nothing better than a photograph. While I was busy, so was Brent stripping down the Mustang. Even though we're using very little of this shell, we're gonna have it media blasted so it's easier to cut up. Now back to our frame. Before I go any further, I've got to have an engine in place to determine the rest of the build. So I'm gonna use this shoebox to fill in for my oil pan that I've got on order, and I'm gonna use this plastic block to mock it all up. The goal here is to get the engine as close to the ground as possible. By doing this, when you're throwing it into those turns, you decrease your body roll, which improves your traction and your control. Being that there's no rules on engine placement in the outlaw classes, I'm going to shove mine back as far as I can for better weight transfer. It's going to be about 2 inches into the firewall. Now some additional bracing and some temporary mounts to hold the engine in place. First thing is the cross member. Now I don't want it to be any lower than my frame rails, and I'm using 1x2 stock, and I've got plenty of room. This 1x2 065 wall tubing will be the mounting point for our lower control arms. I'm cheating a little. Holding half of the cross member in place and level, Brent can mark it for the next cut. Right there. Now at this point, I've only tacked in my cross member because when I build my front suspension, it's going to dictate exactly where it's going to go. It's time for some more documentation. We're going to see how far we can get on this frame later on in the show. Today Today's show is all about keeping Trans Am racing alive. Back then, the Cuda was on the showroom floors, but it wasn't until Dan Gurney got his hands on one and decided to go racing. That's when the AAR Cuda was born.
Today's MuscleCar Flashback, the All-American Racers Trans Am Cuda.
The AAR Cuda is exactly what you need for a nice, quiet cruise. Most muscle cars would rather not go around turns, but this one's a street version of a Trans Am race car. Along with its corporate cousin, the Challenger RT, the AAR Cuda was Mopar's first small block six-pack. Chrysler built just over 2,700 AARs so they could go racing in the Trans Am series. That required a small block pony car that could run hard on the road course, perfect for Chrysler's brand new B-body. It was wide for a car that size, built around a B-body cow, so there was room for a 440 or a Hemi if you wanted. High rear quarters and a low roof gave it that crouched down and dangerous look. Side exhaust and that strobe stripe came standard, and the tires were small in front, so it would sit just right. The AAR name came from All-American Racer, the shop that built the Cuda race car. Chrysler built the AAR for about 5 weeks in the spring of 1970, and that was it. Barracuda buyers had a lot of choices that year, 9 different engine packages. Everything from the 340, the 383, the 440, a 318, but would you believe? Even the Slant 6 and the Hemi. The AAR Cuda was right in the middle and maybe the best road racer of the bunch. Not the most powerful, but strong enough and built to handle.
Not having a big bar V8 over the front wheels means the car actually does turn. It's actually a lot of fun.
That 6-pack 340 ran 3 two-barrel hollows, Edelbrock aluminum manifold. The block was set up to take 4-bolt mains with a little modification. Inside, a collapsible steering column and a pistol grip Hurst shifter on the 4-speed. Torque flights were optional, but who would want one of those? Just like the Trans Am cars, the Street 6-pack was built for high-speed power, not low-speed torque. But the AAR Cuda could still turn them over. Brute power was king back in the 70s, so big block challenges got a lot more attention. But the AAR was more civilized, more comfortable on the streets. You might even call it a muscle car that's gone to chump school.
The dealer's version may not have won any races, but on the streets, it was still a serious contender. We'll be back. All right, sit down, hold on. I got a lot more work to do. In case you just joined us, let me tell you what you missed. We're transforming this 65 Mustang into a road race monster. It's been stripped and sent off to be blasted. Since we're running in the NASA Outlaw class, this punched out Windsor will throw it around the turns. I started a frame to hold this all together and photograph everything for tech inspection. Now I've already made my cross member as a platform to mount my lower control arm and my standard engine mount. But being that this thing's gonna be suffering a lot of stress and G-forces, front and rear engine plates are a must. These are from Comp Engineering. 1/8-inch steel plates for our Windsor. I'll recheck the positioning of the mock-up block, and with some standard 3/16 gussets from A&A, I'll mount it to the kick-ups. These plates are oversized, so just cut out what you don't need. Again, recheck everything before and after you weld. Some of you are probably wondering what this is for. Being in our mid-plate mounts between our engine and our bell housing, This spacer will compensate for the added distance to the tranny. Everything on the front of the engine is aluminum, such as the water pump. So what I decided to do is go on an aluminum front plate that keeps the corrosion down to a minimum. Now remember, it goes on just like the mid, so pay attention to your levels when you're putting it on. Now I can stop right here, and these engine plates would do the job just fine. But for added peace of mind, I'm going to use these stock style engine mounts from Prothane, and they'll mount to the cross member once it's secured. At this point, the engine is right where I want it to be, and it is a good starting point for the front end. So let's move on and stiffen up the center of the frame. The goal for this next step is to triangulate your frame, because that's where your strength comes from. 1 by 2 inch stock will leave us some room underneath the frame for fuel and brake lines. And with the inner side rail 7.5 inches away from the outer, we'll have plenty of room to tuck the exhaust up nice and tight. A temporary cross member will keep things square. We'll tie the inners to the outers, and then triangulate the inside front and rear. I can't do anything south of here till I get the front end in place. Once I get that in place, that'll tell me where the rear end's gonna go. All in all, not bad for a few days worth of work. Later.